Today we're going to go over number 3, creating an Azure data lake and using that for the ODX storage. Now, before we get started, we do need a few prerequisites, which I've covered most of these in the previous couple of sessions. You can see those videos again in that playlist. But what you'll need here is first and foremost access to the Azure portal. You'll need permission to create Azure resources. And on top of that, you'll also need permission to create an app registration in Azure Active Directory. Now, this is a separate permission from being able to create resources. Even though you may have a resource group available to you, creating an app registration in Active Directory does require an additional permission for you. The next prerequisite is you will need a TimeXtender app server configured. You'll also need the ODX server configured and running in that app server. Okay, so today you can follow along by reviewing this guide here in the knowledge base. You'll see that link posted in the chat in just a couple seconds here. And that KB article is to use Azure Data Lake Storage with TimeXtender. Now we need to go over a few steps today. Step number 1 is creating the app registration. So why don't we go ahead and just dive right into that. First of all, you need to get into the Azure portal, and you can go to that by going to portal.azure.com. And then in the search menu, just search for Active Directory. You should see an option here for Azure Active Directory and navigate to your Azure Active Directory. Now we are going to need to note down some information, which we will need to plug into TimeXtender in just a little bit here. The first piece of information we need is the tenant ID for the tenant that your Azure tenant is in. All right, so copy that tenant ID and paste that over to the side. The next thing we'll need to do is on the left-hand bar here in Azure Active Directory, go to App Registrations and click on New Registration. I'm going to call this app registration TX Tuesdays. Okay. The next option is to who can access or who can use this application or access this API. Do you want anyone to access it, or is it specifically only for your own tenant? If you do have a multi-tenant setup, you might want to consider using one of these other options here. However, I'm going to use this accounts in this organization directory only and click register. So that's going to create the app registration for me. And what I'll need from here is the application ID. So we have here an app registration called TX Tuesdays, and we'll need that application ID to plug that into TimeXtender later. So I'm going to paste that over to the side. And then on the left-hand side, you want to navigate under that app registration, navigate to certificates and secrets. And then in this menu, click on New Client Secret. This is going to create a secret, a key, or a password, essentially, for this app registration. We can give this a description. Again, this is just a friendly name here. So I'll call this TX Tuesdays. And then I'll increase the expiration date to 24 months and click Add. Okay, so I have that secret now available to me, and I can copy this secret to the clipboard. And I want to paste that again over to the side. This is very important because after this screen goes away, you won't be able to view this value of the secret any longer. And that's for security purposes. So you need to copy this and save this over into a safe place. All right. So now we have created that app registration. We've also created the secret for the app registration. Step number 3 is we want to create the data lake. We're going to provision an Azure storage resource in the Azure portal. Going back to the Azure portal here, I want to navigate to my resource group that I've been using for TX Tuesdays. I call it TX Tuesdays 1 here. And then I can click on Add in the top menu for TX Tuesdays resource group. At the bottom of this menu, you can either search for Azure Storage, or I have here a storage account, and I can just click and add the storage account there. Okay, as you can see, it's already placed that storage account within my subscription and my resource group. Next, I want to give this storage account a name. I am going to call this TX Tuesdays storage. Okay. You want to make sure that the location is in the same location of your other resources. Now, I've been using West US 2 for all of my different resources here, so I want to plug that into the same location. And this is just going to reduce latency when communicating with the data lake from your virtual machine or your SQL databases. Okay, next is the account kind. We want to use version 2. And finally, we have the redundancy or the replication. Locally redundant storage is going to be the cheapest option. You can choose more robust redundancy if you need to with these additional options here. Next is networking. I'm going to use a public endpoint and Microsoft network routing. Data protection, I don't need to turn on any options here. And then advanced, this is a very important option. When creating a data lake, you need to make sure that this option is checked. Data Lake Storage Gen 2 Hierarchical Namespace. That's what makes the Azure Storage account a Data Lake Gen 2 storage account. All right, so you want to click Enabled there and click Next. I'm not going to add any tags. I'm simply going to review and then click Create. So that will create my storage account. Once the storage account is provisioned, what I'll need to do is I will need to go to the storage account and ensure that that app registration I just created has access to and permissions to use and manipulate that storage account. And then what we'll do is we'll use that app registration in TimeXtender. So that's how it will authenticate to Azure and be able to make changes within the data lake. Now that the resource is provisioned, I can go into the storage account. I have my TX Tuesdays storage here, and I want to click on Access Control. So here is where I add role permissions or role assignments, and I just want to click Add here at the top and add role assignment. Select a role. You have a lot of different options here. Now you have the option to use Azure Blob Azure Blob Data Contributor. This will work for a majority of the functionality that we use the storage account for. However, it will not work for implementing security permissions. So if you did want to lock certain tables or files within the data lake and secure those using TimeXtender, you will need to select the owner role. So I'm going to select owner. Next is to change the type. What am I allowing access to? And you do want to select user group or service principal. This is a service principal that I'm using here, this app registration. And I call the app registration TX Tuesdays. So type that in, it'll appear in the list. Click on TX Tuesdays and then click Save. So what I've done is I've given TX Tuesdays owner permissions or owner access to the Azure Data Lake. Okay, now I've enabled the app registration access to the data lake. The final step here is to add data lake as an ODX storage in TimeXtender. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open my virtual machine. Here we have the Azure virtual machine we created in the previous sessions. And I simply right click on data lake or ODX and then click Manage ODX. Now you can see I have my ODX running. I do have here, you can see there's no storage that has been added. So it's right click to add a data storage. And then you want to select Add Azure Data Lake Gen 2 Data Storage. First things first is to provide this data storage with a name. Now this is just a friendly name, so you can refer to it with other people using the project. I'm going to call this ADLS Gen 2. The next is for the Azure Active Directory information that we just created, right? So we have the tenant ID, the application ID, and the application key or the secret that we created just a few moments ago. So I'm going to copy this information from where I saved it over to the side. First things first, we do have our tenant ID. I'm going to paste that in. And then next we have our app ID from that app registration. I will paste that in as well. And then finally, we do have our secret, which I copied and pasted over here. And I'm going to paste that in next. Okay, so we have our Azure Active Directory. We can authenticate to Azure and let it know we do have permissions to make changes to this storage account. The next thing we need is the account name. So I'm going to go ahead and grab that. We go again here to our storage account, TX Tuesdays storage. I will copy that, go back into the ODX and paste that account name in here. So this is the name of the Azure storage account. Okay. Next thing is to create a container. We can do that directly from within TimeXtender. We want to do it from within TimeXtender. That way TimeXtender can add certain metadata that it needs to ensure it's talking with the right container. All right. So I'm going to call this TX Tuesdays container and click create. Now TimeXtender will use the Azure REST API. It will define the tenant ID. It will also define the app registration and key to authenticate with Azure. It will then define the account name, the storage account name, and it'll use that REST API to create a container within that storage account. Click OK. We can navigate back to our Azure storage, and we can click on containers. By scrolling down, we can see here we did create a TX Tuesdays container here from TimeXtender. Now, back in the virtual machine, I just want to cover these options as well. The next option we have here is timeouts. Now, you do want to be aware of the timeouts. If you do have some extremely long running loads, some very large data sources that may take up to a day or so to load that entire data source for the initial full load, you do want to be aware of these timeouts. You want to be able to increase these timeouts as needed. Now, the default options here are fairly robust, so I'd recommend keeping the defaults unless needed. Unless you are encountering some timeouts, you can go ahead and increase these. Now, the next option is transfer to data warehouse. Now, what you can do here is if you're not using Azure Data Factory to transfer between the Azure storage and the TimeXtender data warehouse, so the SQL database that we're going to be using, when you're transferring from the ODX storage, the data lake, to the Azure SQL database data warehouse, you can actually leverage the virtual machine to move that data. Now, of course, a virtual machine is a limited resource. It's going to have a limited amount of memory. And so what you can do is you can limit the memory usage here to ensure that you're not hitting the memory capacity of that virtual machine. Now, it is recommended to use Azure Data Factory for this data transport, and that's what we're going to be setting up in our next session. Okay, so I've created the data lake and use that in TimeXtender for my ODX storage.